My question's on the terrible bombing of hospital facilities in Yemen, Syria and Afghanistan, which are obviously a matter of significant and immense public concern around the world. There's been at least 23 attacks on hospitals in East Aleppo in the last 3 months. Every functioning hospital in East Aleppo has been damaged. What's the department's appraisal of the current tactics that are killing civilians in Syria and Yemen, particularly those receiving medical attention?
Thank you.
Sorry, I didn't catch the question, I'm afraid. Sorry, Senator, was the question how many, or just a general issue about what we're doing about it?
Yeah, what's your appraisal of the current tactics that are killing civilians, particularly those seeking medical attention?
Well, I think it's my assessment, Senator, it's a deliberate tactic of war, and I think that's the assessment, I think, of the most of the international community. You know, there's clearly a campaign underway to terrorise the populace of Aleppo. The Assad regime over the years has used surrender and starve sort of set of tactics, and eastern Aleppo is now encircled, and obviously they're trying to deliver as much military ordnance into that area as they possibly can to force the force those who are resisting there to surrender.
Is it clear who's actually responsible for the attacks?
Beg your pardon?
Is it clear who's actually responsible for the attacks on hospitals?
Well, I mean, I think the international community is pretty clear. It's Syrian aircraft and also possibly Russian aircraft that are responsible for these attacks.
Could you clarify Australia's position on these acts?
Well, we condemn them absolutely, Senator.
Excellent. Are you confident Australia's activity and operations overseas meets or exceeds the rules of engagement, especially in relation to medical and humanitarian personnel, facilities and transport?
That's really a matter for the Department of Defence, Senator. But I know the Department of Defence has very robust rules of engagement, and every care is taken to avoid civilian casualties.
Okay. In relation to the UN Security Council, the unanimously passed resolution 2286, I understand Australia was part of that resolution.
Colleagues going to take that, Senator.
Senator Michael Bliss, Assistant Secretary, International Legal Branch. Australia was a co-sponsor of that resolution.
Okay, excellent. In relation to the recommendations on that resolution, there were a number of them. Are you working with the Department of Defence or other agencies in terms of implementing those recommendations, or can you give us an update on any progress in relation to those?
The Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, along with the Attorney General's Department, works very closely and on an ongoing basis with the Department of Defence on issues such as rules of engagement and so on, and that is to ensure that the manner in which the ADF engage in armed conflict is entirely consistent with our obligations under international law.
Are you prepared to make a comment on the usefulness of this resolution and its recommendations? Are you confident, given over 80 countries signed it, that it will have an impact?
Resolution 2286 was a very strong restatement of the international law which applies to the immunity, if you like, that is afforded to hospitals and medical facilities in times of armed conflict. I should note, Senator, that in many ways that resolution flows directly from the work that Australia did on the Security Council during its term in 2013-14, in which we pursued a series of resolutions which went to the delivery of humanitarian assistance in Syria.
Okay. Look, I have a number of specific questions on those recommendations, but I'll put them on notice because I understand the committee's short on time. But could I ask, in terms of the general situation in Syria around Aleppo, there's been recent reports, and I would probably say an escalation of concern in reports about a potential conflict between Allied forces and Russian and the Assad regime forces. Is this something DFAT's taking seriously? I understand you'll be working with the Department of Defence on this, but is there a serious potential for conflict, major conflict between Allied forces and Russian forces?
I'll try and answer that, Senator. At this stage, I'm not sure that we would share that assessment, imminent prospect of conflict between coalition forces, Russian and Syrian forces, because we're not... Allied aviation is not actually operating in Aleppo or around Aleppo. It's only focused on Daesh targets. So, I mean, there's always a prospect of miscalculation, but there's a communication channel between the United States and the Russians about, who flies where. Defence could give you more detail on that. But in terms of the overall situation around Aleppo, the situation has deteriorated significantly. In recent weeks, there's been a large number of civilians killed. As we speak, the Russians have announced a brief pause in operations there supposedly to allow humanitarian assistance in. I think the window they've given is about 8 hours.
8 hours, yeah.
It's not a very long period of time. I mean, the international community, there had been earlier an agreement in September, the 9th of September, for a complete nationwide cessation of hostilities. So, a gap for a break for 8 hours is not, is not enough, and it needs to be enduring. So, we and others have, Australia participates in a humanitarian task force that meets in Geneva every week. It sits under the International Support Group for Syria, and we continue to urge, as well as there's a separate task force on the ceasefire, sitting under that group, and we and others continue to urge for a restoration of that cessation of hostilities, so that that can be end the suffering for people, but also provide a space for some political negotiations, Senator.
Right. Well, my last two questions were actually about the peace process, if you can call it that. I know the attempts at peace, whether you're confident that there's still enough goodwill within the international community to continue those.
Well, the situation does indeed look very grim, Senator. I mean, the events around Aleppo coming, as foreign ministers were meeting in New York in September, were, seemed to cut completely across international efforts to find a solution of the crisis. So I don't think people have given up. We can't give up. I mean, certainly I've seen that Secretary Kerry and others have been very vigorous in pursuing this. Without much to work with, frankly, from the other side. And, my personal assessment is at this stage there seems little indication that the Assad regime is willing to sit down and have a sensible, serious political negotiation, but we have to keep chipping away. Okay.
Well, my last question relates probably to that final point and my earlier question about potential flashpoints for conflict. It's been reported that the US were prepared to take quite strong measures against Russians. The Russian military around, I suppose, accusations of targeting medical facilities and other atrocities, and that they may stop talking to them. That was one thing that was commented on. I'm not sure what other issues would be being explored in terms of putting pressure on the Russians themselves and the Assad regime. Can you comment on, I mean, obviously we're allies with the US, so this is something of significant concern to us as well.
Senator, at this stage, the only options that are being seriously explored are a continuation of political options, negotiations, trying to reinstate some sort of ceasefire, what to do about Jabhat al-Nusra, which has been their presence in eastern Aleppo has been a vexatious issue, a complicating issue. So the effort is very much in the diplomatic track.
Could I ask, just in relation to one comment you made, this is my very last question, Chair. You mentioned the word, these attacks on hospitals are designed to terrorise the population. Does that mean you would classify the the combatants who are doing this as terrorists?
Well, I don't. We'd have to look at each individual case, Senator, who they are. But I mean, hypothetically, I can't give you an answer because you'd have to look at the specifics of. There are certain groups that are designated as terrorists, including in the United Nations, and others that are not. So, and
that's
definition
very subjective.
and the definition of who is a terrorist and who isn't is obviously one of the key key points of contention between the Russians and the regime and other members of the international community. So it's a very loaded issue.
Thank you,
And
Senator
it was a loaded
Whish-Wilson.
question.
I'll return to you now, Senator Wong.